Paris, 1886, a city in love with stone. For 2,000 years, the skyline of this city has been ruled by stone, by Notre Dame, by the dome of Les Invalides, by the soft gray rooftops of a civilization that believes beauty comes from carved limestone and patient masons. And now, on a drafting table in a quiet office on Rue de Prony, a 53-year-old engineer is about to challenge all of it. Not with marble, with iron. His name is Gustave Eiffel, and the structure he is about to build will be taller than every building on Earth, nearly twice as tall as the next tallest thing humans have made. It will rise 300 meters into the Parisian sky using nothing but wrought iron, mathematics, and 2.5 million rivets. Most of Paris's artists believe it will be a monstrosity. Many of its engineers believe it will fall down, and almost no one believes it can be built in time. They have 2 years, 2 months, and 5 days. This is the story of how the Eiffel Tower was built, not as a monument, but as one of the most audacious engineering problems of the 19th century. If you love stories where engineering and history collide, hit subscribe. This is exactly the kind of story we dig into every week. To understand why this tower terrified so many people, you have to understand what 300 meters meant in 1886. The tallest structure on the planet at that time was the Washington Monument at 169 meters. Eiffel wasn't proposing to beat that record. He was proposing to nearly double it with a building material that had only recently become viable at scale on a foundation that had to support 10,000 tons in the middle of a city where the soil near the Seine was notoriously soft and waterlogged. The design wasn't even originally Eiffel's. 2 of his employees, Maurice Coquelin and Émile Nouchier, sketched the first concept, a tall iron pylon made of 4 lattice girders, separated at the base and converging at the top. Eiffel thought it looked unfinished, too skeletal, and handed it to his head of architecture, Stephen Souster, to dress it up with arches, glass-walled pavilions, and ornamental flourishes. The tower people know today is in a strange way a compromise between cold engineering and architectural styling. But the bones, the 4-legged lattice, were always the real breakthrough. And the man who had to prove that breakthrough actually worked was Eiffel. Because here is the central problem nobody could ignore. At 300 meters, the single greatest threat to this structure was never going to be gravity. It was going to be wind. Eiffel did not come to this project as an artist. He came to it as a bridge builder. And that detail matters more than almost anything else in this story. For 2 decades, he had designed railway bridges across the windswept gorges of the Massif Central, a region known for brutal, sustained winds tearing through narrow valleys. He had learned the hard way what happens when an engineer underestimates wind load on a tall, exposed structure. In 1879, the Tay Bridge in Scotland collapsed in a storm, killing roughly 75 people because its designer failed to properly calculate wind pressure. Eiffel studied disasters like this obsessively. He was not going to let it happen to him. So when he took ownership of the tower design, the question he kept returning to was brutally simple. How do you build something this tall without the wind tearing it apart? His answer was mathematics, specifically a calculation method from his bridges, where he modeled the wind pressure acting on every point along the tower's height, then shaped the structure so the iron at each level resisted exactly that local pressure, no more, no less. The curvature of the tower's 4 legs was mathematically determined to offer the most efficient resistance to wind. Eiffel himself described the principle this way: the cutting force of the wind, striking the leading edge of each iron upright, gets redirected and absorbed into the interior of the structure rather than slamming against a flat surface. In plain terms, the tower's iconic curve isn't decoration, it's a wind flow equation frozen in iron. This reason the Eiffel Tower doesn't look like a single tapering cone and doesn't look like a straight obelisk either. It has that distinctive, almost exponential curve, wide and flared at the base, narrowing aggressively as it climbs. Engineers today still debate the exact mathematical model Eiffel used. One hypothesis, reconstructed in 2004 from Eiffel's own letters to French engineering societies, describes it as a non-linear integral equation that balances wind pressure against the tension in the structural elements at every point on the tower.
What that means practically: imagine wind hitting the tower at any height. Eiffel wanted the iron at that exact height to have just enough cross-section in the just right angle to convert that wind force into compression running down through the legs into the ground, without bending, without snapping, without resonating into a dangerous sway. Every section of the tower was solving its own local wind equation. Stack those thousands of solved equations on top of each other, and you get that unmistakable silhouette.
And then there's the lattice itself, the open ironwork that lets you see straight through the structure from almost any angle. That openness wasn't aesthetic either. Engineers calculated the surface area of the open lattice specifically to let wind pass through rather than slam against it, preventing the kind of pressure buildup that could cause catastrophic failure. A solid walled tower of the same height would have caught the wind like a sail. The lattice does the opposite. It lets wind through, resisting as much as the math demands. The numbers back this up. Eiffel built in a large safety margin, engineering the tower to withstand wind pressures of 4 kilonewtons per square meter, dramatically beyond anything Paris weather would realistically produce. It paid off. The fastest wind ever recorded at the tower hit 214 kilometers per hour in 1999, and the structure didn't flinch structurally. Even in extreme gusts, the tower sways by at most about 9 centimeters, less than 4 inches of movement at the top of a building taller than a 75-story skyscraper. But mathematics on paper is one thing. Building it was another problem entirely. And this is where the story turns from a wind equation to a logistics nightmare. Eiffel's team produced 18,038 individual iron parts. And here's the detail that should stop you cold. Every piece was designed and drawn to a precision of 1/10 of a millimeter, roughly the thickness of a human hair, on iron that might be installed 280 meters above the ground. There was no room for close enough. If a single bracket was off by a few millimeters, the misalignment would compound floor after floor, and by the top, the whole structure could be fatally out of true. So Eiffel prefabricated almost the entire tower off-site, something nearly unheard of for a project this size. Every part was manufactured at his factory in Levallois-Perret, then transported and assembled like a kit, essentially the great-grandfather of modern Manchester construction, compressed into the 1880s, with no power tools, no cranes capable of 1/10 millimeter feedback, and no precedent to learn from. To hold those 18,038 parts together, crews used more than 2.5 million rivets. Only about a third were installed on site. The rest were driven in at the factory, where conditions were controlled. On-site riveting was a brutal 4-person dance, performed hundreds of feet in the air. One worker heated the rivet red hot, a second held it in place, a third shaped the head, a fourth swung the hammer that drove it home. Multiply that by over 800,000 rivets on a structure with no elevators yet built. In Parisian winters, the workers themselves called brutal. And here is the number that should genuinely surprise you, given everything you just heard about height, iron, exposed scaffolding, and 4-person riveting teams swinging hammers 200 meters in the air with no modern safety regulation in existence yet. Officially, 1 person died during the entire construction of the Eiffel Tower. That single fatality didn't even happen on the structure itself. It happened because a worker left the site against instructions and died elsewhere nearby. By the strictest accounting, depending on which historical record you trust, some accounts put the on-site death toll at 0, with the one confirmed fatality being an Italian worker who died visiting the tower days after construction had already wrapped. For comparison, the Panama Canal, built in roughly the same era, killed an estimated 30,000 workers. The Hawk's Nest Tunnel project in the United States killed hundreds within just a few years of completion. Even decades later, the original World Trade Center construction recorded 60 deaths. The Eiffel Tower, taller than anything humanity had built before it, assembled with 19th century tools at heights nobody had ever worked at, should statistically have been a bloodbath. It wasn't, because Eiffel made worker safety a structural requirement, not an afterthought. He mandated guardrails and safety screens across the site, required safety harnesses at height, virtually unheard of at the time, and installed an on-site medical clinic for immediate treatment of any injury.
Much of the credit for the near-zero death toll goes directly to that extensive use of guardrails and screens. The workforce itself was modest by modern standards, around 50 engineers and 132 ironworkers, men so famous for working calmly at extreme heights that Parisians nicknamed them acrobats. Eiffel reportedly paid them above the going site rate precisely because he understood that exhausted, underpaid men make fatal mistakes at height. That safety record isn't a footnote. It's arguably as important an achievement as the tower's wind resistance. Both came from the same philosophy: model every risk precisely and design it out before it becomes a catastrophe.
None of this silenced the critics, at least not at first. While the iron legs rose over the Champ de Mars, a group of France's most prominent writers, painters, and architects signed a public letter branding the unfinished tower an eyesore that would humiliate Paris before the world. Eiffel's response has outlived nearly every one of his critics. He argued that the very conditions giving the tower its strength were the same conditions giving it harmony, that there was no contradiction between a structure being mathematically optimized and being beautiful. He said wind resistance was the single concern that had occupied him above all others in designing the tower, and that the resulting shape, however strange to 1880s eyes, was simply what honest resistance to nature looks like. History, fairly emphatically, sided with the engineer. The tower opened on March 31st, 1889, completed in 2 years, 2 months, and 3 days, almost exactly on the original schedule, an almost unthinkable feat of project management for a structure with zero engineering precedent anywhere on the planet. It welcomed 2 million visitors during the World's Fair alone, and the same Parisian press that had mocked it as a monstrosity quietly stopped printing those letters of protest. What's easy to miss standing underneath it today is that almost nothing about its appearance is decorative. Structural historian David Billington observed that the tower's shape visually expresses the engineer's ideal for resisting wind, meaning the silhouette tourists photograph by the millions is quite literally a wind load calculation you can walk inside of. The 4 splayed legs, the tightening curve, the open lattice you can see the sky through from nearly any angle. Every one of those choices exists because a bridge engineer from the wind-swept mountains of central France refused to let Paris's tallest building fall down. It hasn't in over 135 years now. And the iron that once terrified a city now defines its skyline more than any cathedral. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe for more deep dives into the engineering behind the world's most iconic structures.